Hello everyone, Vincent here from HDTV Test here. You are looking at the HDR calibration settings screen in Cyberpunk 2077 played from a Sony PS5. And in this video, I'm going to explain these different HDR settings and also show you why I think HDR may be broken in this game. Now, to get to this screen, you will first need to enable HDR mode in the game itself. And the way to do it is obviously to select HDR10PQ. And if you actually select none, then it will be outputting in SDR. But because the Sony PS5 is force converting all SDR games to HDR, you will still be playing the game in some sort of HDR manner if you are playing it on the PS5, unless you switch off HDR from the console itself. But let's select HDR10PQ and we shall explore these different HDR settings. Before I proceed, I would like to explain the different elements you are seeing on screen. I'm displaying this game on a Canon DP-V2411 reference broadcast monitor. It has an excellent inbuilt HDR analysis toolkit, and at the top left corner you can see a frame luminance monitor. This will record and measure the highest peak brightness within each frame and also the maximum frame average luminance level, or max FALL2. And if I can bring up the waveform monitor, now conventionally I have always put this waveform monitor at the bottom left corner in my previous HDR analysis videos. But for the purpose of this demonstration, I have decided to put it on the bottom right corner because I just like trying out different positions. But seriously, it is because I think putting it at the bottom right corner will obscure and cover up less of the UI and menus to make my life easier for the purpose of this demonstration, which is why I've actually put it at the bottom right corner. So let's start with maximum brightness. And there are actually three parameters here: maximum brightness, paper white, and also total mapping midpoint. Let's start with maximum brightness. This will actually just ask the game engine to scale the brightest elements on screen to whatever you set on this slider here. So currently it is set to a value of 500 nits by default, and you can see from the frame luminance monitor at your top left corner and also the waveform monitor at your bottom right corner that the brightest element on screen will be around 500 nits. And this not only applies to this particular calibration screen, it also applies in-game as well. So if I can get out from here and get into this really early sequence, you can see three square lamps hanging down from the ceiling, and these will correspond to 500 nits, just like what we set the maximum brightness value to be at in the HDR settings screen. So what I'm going to do now is to increase the maximum brightness setting and then let you see the effect. And the thing is, my camera is going to be overexposed now, so I will drop the camera exposure, if you can bear with me for a while, and we'll just settle at 1000 nits, which incidentally is the maximum peak brightness that this reference broadcast monitor is capable of. And you can see from the waveform and also from the frame luminance monitor, if I can actually press the reset button, it fluctuates between say 1000 nits to 1100 nits to 1200 nits. I think it is just how the monitor is actually analyzing all these different bits, different HDMI input. But it is close to 1000 nits, and if we go back into the game itself, you can see that the sky lamps here, they are all sitting at around 1000 nits as well. But one concern to me that is particularly obvious on the screen is that the black floor has actually been elevated. If you look at the waveform monitor at the bottom right corner, 0, there is a line there that corresponds to true black. True black means that there is no light being emitted on screen. It should be 0, 0, 0 in terms of the PQ code value. But clearly, with the game engine, when running in HDR mode, there is no true black in this game, so blacks will always look elevated. And if you increase the peak brightness, what the game engine is doing, I think, is to just scale an SDR based image to the maximum peak brightness, causing a really washed out image with muted and diluted colors as well. And the reason why the colors will look diluted and muted is because if you think about, let's say, an object that is pure red in color, if your blacks are inky black, then the red can be expressed properly. But if your blacks are grayish, like what it is in this case, then the grays will be added to the red color in the object itself, turning it maybe pinkish. It is a simple analogy, but I hope you get my drift, which is why I think, with this sort of raised or elevated black floor, that the colors will look quite muted and diluted in HDR mode in this game as well. So if we can go back into the HDR settings and we can just try and drop it down to 500. Okay, and next we are going to explore paper white. Paper white will just determine the brightness of the UI on screen, let's say HUD, let's say any text. And if you look at the bottom right corner and I turn off this waveform monitor, you can see that there are this select and back options here. And if I actually increase the paper white, you can see these elements actually growing brighter on screen as well. You can see, this will become brighter on screen, and it only affects the UI elements. And the game developers have set it such that the UI will never exceed the maximum brightness, and it will in fact be sitting slightly lower, say 100 nits lower. So let's say if I increase it to maximum, it will still be capped at 400 nits. Currently, it will never go up. And if I actually increase the maximum brightness here, then you can see that the UI will be allowed to increase in peak brightness. But I think the paper white setting will be very helpful for OLED owners out there if you wish to try and reduce the risk of image retention or permanent burn-in. Then maybe you should try and go for a really low paper white value to make the HUD not as bright and in fact as dark as possible, so that it won't damage your OLED screen. And the most confusing parameter on this calibration screen would be the tone mapping midpoint. And initially I was confused as hell because however much I change it, it doesn't seem to change any of the brightness element on this particular calibration screen. But that is because there is a bug. It only affects in-game image. So I shall leave it at 2 for now and then go back into the game. And you can see that this is the current waveform at the bottom right corner. I don't think it can qualify as true HDR. It is fairly compressed, and I think that it is just being scaled from SDR with a maximum peak brightness of 500 nits and an elevated black floor. Now look at what happens if I actually reduce the tone mapping midpoint all the way to the minimum of 0.05. So if I actually drop it all the way to 0.05, then what it will do to the game itself is to obviously deepen the blacks. You can see that the black floor is currently much closer to 0, which is true black. But unfortunately, it also depresses the maximum peak brightness of the in-game image. You can see that the 3 sky lamps there, currently they are sitting at around 50 nits, and the maximum peak brightness in the screen, from certain UIs is only around 120, 130 nits. So this is really not what we want. We want deep blacks, but we don't want to sacrifice brightness. And this is also part of the reason why I think that let me just increase the exposure of my camera for a while. And this is also the reason why I think, there is a high likelihood that the HDR presentation in this game is just being derived from SDR, because, all these different HDR settings parameter, they are doing a linear scale. You're not actually increasing the dynamic range at all. You're just actually pulling it up and down. So if I can go back out to the HDR settings screen, and I think with the tone mapping midpoint, what we want to do is to find sort of a compromise, a happy medium, where the blacks are the deepest possible, because if you actually increase it to 2, then I think the whole image looks overexposed to me, because it is just basically scaling it up from HDR. So I think a good medium ground would be to find a point where the blacks are the deepest possible without the peak brightness dropping below, say, 500 nits. So we have set maximum brightness at 500 nits now. If we leave it at 1, you can see that the picture looks punchier because the blacks are deeper than when we set tone mapping midpoint at 2. And yet, the maximum peak brightness in terms of the sky lamps, they are still sitting at around 500. So there is no drop in peak brightness. Nevertheless, I still think that a lot of the elements on screen are still too dark, because if you want to achieve deep blacks, the whole scale of the tone mapping midpoint is linear. So a lot of the midtones will look too dark, and a lot of the shadows will look too dark. In my opinion, it is not a true HDR image. It's just being scaled from HDR. And let's be honest here, the blacks are not even inky black. So you get this really washed out look and a really abrupt transition from the shadows to the midtones to the bright highlight detail. And the bright highlight detail is so bright, yet the midtones is nowhere near. The transition there is so abrupt. It is probably as abrupt as the classic pickup line, nice shoes, wanna So from that point of view, I am not impressed by this HDR picture at all. I think it is being scaled from HDR. It is, in my opinion, broken. The blacks are not really truly black, and the transition from the shadows to the midtones to the highlights, it's just being scaled really badly, and you get no feeling of HDR. You don't get any wow, and this is a shame, because this game is made for HDR in terms of the neon lights, in terms of just how futuristic the whole game should look. And if I can also try and load another scene for you, and let's say I will go to the apartment, and notice that when I load a scene, this cutscene here, it is capped at 100 nits. Again, you can see that the blacks are actually truly inky black, but it is capped at 100 nits, and then it jumps up to 200 nits and slowly drop down. And this, to me, when I see 100 nits in an HDR container, to me that just screams SDR in HDR, and I believe that this game is just being done in SDR, and the HDR output is just being derived from the SDR elements. And you can see here that the fluorescent lights just above the door would be around 500 nits, but a lot of the elements are too dark. If we wanted to achieve really, really deep blacks, a lot of the elements are too dark, and I don't think that this game is a best showcase of HDR. And I would suggest my best recommendation for the HDR settings in this game, and that is actually to turn HDR10 off. And I believe that you can get a much better experience playing in SDR. And if there's any interest, I will do a side-by-side comparison between SDR and HDR in this game. And this HDR problem doesn't only affect the PS5, it also affects the Xbox Series X, which I've tested, and also from what other people have told me, it affects the PC version as well. So I think maybe we need to try and investigate further, but for now I believe that you can get the best picture quality from this game by playing it in SDR. If you'd like to watch some of our other HDR game analysis, I created a playlist here. If you'd like to click on it, and I will see you in the next video.